Author Howard Blum joins us to tell us all about his new book on the Idaho 4 killings.
We'll see what he has to say.
What does he think is going on with the Idaho 4 case in his book, The Night Comes Falling? Today, we dive deeper into the Idaho 4 case. I'm Lainey Law.
And I'm attorney Andrew Myers.
And today we have the pleasure of being joined by New York Times bestseller, Howard Blum. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
And we also have our wonderful intern Red with us today, as well as Yolie Medina. How are you guys doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Awesome. So, Andrew, you had put together a wonderful interview that we're going to go through today.
Well, everybody can ask questions.
I'm a little starstruck. This is like our most esteemed guest that we have on today.
Howard, the first thing I wanted to ask you before we launch into the substantive thing is, how is it that you decided that this case would be the subject of your next book?
Completely by accident. The way I got into this at the beginning is we're sitting on around the Thanksgiving table in Connecticut about 2 years ago, just about a week after the murders occurred. And people at the table, after we discussed family matters, politics, they started talking about this case. I hadn't paid much attention to it, but it was such a perplexing mystery. And I just spent the past several months in Oxford studying, of all things, Russian history. Going for my graduate, I had a graduate degree that I got before some of the professors were even born at Stanford 100 years ago, but I'd gone back because I was just sort of fascinated and I had the opportunity. So I then decided, I had enough of academics. I wanted to do something in the field again, put out my trench coat, go off and investigate a matter. And I called up Graydon Carter, who I'd worked with at Vanity Fair, and he said, go out for us for Airmail, his new publication, we'll take it. And I went out there not to write a book, not even to report necessarily on the case, because I wasn't sure what I would find, but I went out there seeing, at this point, there was no suspect. I wanted to solve the case. I thought I'd go knocking on doors, figure out what happened. And after about 5 days there, it's a tribute to my colossal ego, I thought I had figured everything out. The house was in a sort of a gully. There were some nicer houses around it. I thought someone would have driven by, and I've seen all the police video cams of these kids, their exuberance, their youth, their beauty. I thought it must have been someone from one of these houses. And most of these houses around there were members of this local church group, the Kirkers. And the Kirkers want to turn Moscow, Idaho into, according to the pastor who runs it, a theocracy. They've also had some problems. Their deacon was arrested for child sex charges and is in jail. There were videos about 11 young women who belonged to the church who claimed the sexual charges. These were allegations. But I thought, well, maybe someone was involved with that church. So I go and I try to speak to the pastor in charge of the church, Doug Wilson.
Oh, you did?
He's not returning my calls. Finally, I meet him in the parking lot outside his church office, and he couldn't have been nicer. He's a very charismatic man. He invites me into his office, starts telling me about his church and the problems they're having with the local authorities because of the COVID restrictions. They don't believe in vaccinations. They've had protests. People have been arrested. And suddenly I start looking around, and I'm in this little subterranean office. There are no windows, and I'm about 3 feet away from him. So 2 days later, I hadn't solved the case, but I did get COVID.
Oh my gosh.
That was my initiation into Moscow, Idaho, and into covering this case. But I spent the next 2 years writing articles for Airmail, and that convinced me that there was a story here to be told that could be a book.
Okay, before we get into your final findings as to solving the crime, actually, Intern Red, you actually had done some research and you have some questions for Mr. Blum about Moscow, don't you?
Yeah, actually. So I saw that in the book that you said the town had a history of violence, and it kind of had this ominous, almost vibe to it. Can you let us know why?
Sure. As I point in the book, there was a book written about the town in 1945 by a woman, I think, Claire Ryan, and she talks about the savage winds that blow through the town. That was how she described it. And she was able to write that with some authority because her grandfather was one of the town fathers, and he was just shot dead. He was a doctor for no apparent reason. Then if you go up to any local Moscow cop, on his shoulder patch, he has the emblem is the bell tower, and the bell tower clock is at 1:49 the time, and that was the hour when officer, I think was Newbill, was shot down by a rampaging man who climbed in a church tower and shot also a church member and shot him. There were other bunches of unexplained murders, disappearances. And then I interviewed a detective, a Moscow detective who had been involved in child pornography cases. And he was part of a task force there, and he talked about how that was a problem there. So all that put together, and the drug use. I went to the local drug task force. It keeps on rising and rising, especially along Greek Row. I mean, it's a pretty little place, but there's a lot of pretty poison going on there too.
That's one of the things that is interesting that you point out, because while we were making our videos, I had initially not even made the connection, but with the Daybell case going on in Idaho as well, I just thought that was so interesting that you have these two high-profile crimes going on at the same place in the same location. And it's interesting to me that you mentioned the drug use too, because I come from a small town in New York, where you'll see like a lot of drug use, and a lot of that's attributed to there not being things to do, that people can't go places. So I think that's a good point that you make of how that kind of ties into that, where sometimes you have these big empty spaces where people can get a little bit lost in life.
Right. And also another thing about the town, which is most striking, it's, as one local attorney described it to me, it's a town on the verge of a civil war, because you have a very liberal University of Idaho, that's listed on all sorts of state charts as the #1 party school in Idaho. And at the same time, you have this very ultra-right Christian church group that is the largest church in town, over 2,000 members, that wants to turn the town into a theocracy. So there's this tension. And you walk down Main Street, and on one side of the street are the properties owned by the Christ Church Kirkers group, and the other side are the sort of fun-loving student bars. And you can see this actual divide. It's a very pretty place, but it's a pretty poison in some aspects, as I said.
Yolie, before I jump into my questions, as an attorney that's been following this from the West Coast, did you have any questions for Mr. Blum before I launch into mine?
Well, sure. I want to know what you have to say about those who are saying that you're poisoning the jury or you're tainting the jury. What do you have to say to those people?
Yeah, I think there's still a free press. I mean, I think you can have jury decisions without my book is not going to be influencing. This case has been on the news for everyone in Idaho for the past nearly 2 years. I don't think my book is going to make much of an impression on the people of Moscow, Idaho. I don't even know if my book is for sale there.
I wanted to add a point to that, and that is that I went on to Amazon.com before we did this episode today. There are over 24 books that are out already. There are over 24 books for sale on Amazon.com right now about the Idaho 4 case. And here are half of them. And some of them are better known. The one in the upper right-hand corner, that author has been somewhat outspoken, although he ghosted us when we invited him, unlike Mr. Blum, who's been nice enough to give us some time here. But there's already been a ton of publicity, and as long as I'm showing those, this is the book. This is Mr. Blum's book that we are talking about right now. And with that, I had a couple of questions for you after reading the book and seeing some of the things you said. And one of the questions I have for you is that after a night of drinking at the Corner Club, where Adam Lauda and Jack DeCour's roommate, of course, was the bartender, and this is a mystery, you may not have the answers to this. What, after all, did Maddie say to Adam? Do you have any clue?
Well, I have a clue, but not the specific answer. I mean, it's picked up on a surveillance video that Maddie is talking to Kaylee afterwards, and she says, I've told everything, I think, in effect, to Adam. I think they were talking about her boyfriend, Jack DeCour. She wanted to get back with Jack DeCour. Why do I think that? When they returned to the house at about 2 a.m, there's a series of first 7 phone calls by Kaylee to the boyfriend. And then Maddie also tries to call him. They all go unanswered. But I think part of the reason why she came back was not just to show off her new car to her roommates, but I also think she had a pattern, as all young kids do, and old kids like me too. You break up, you get back together. I think the dynamics of her relationship were in flux. She wanted to move on, and yet at the same time, she was tied very strongly to this boyfriend she had had since high school.
Really? One of the other mysteries in this case is Bethany Funk. And other than signing the lease and being the youngest tenant, Bethany Funk really is not referenced by name in your book, although you called her a, quote, sparky young woman. And although you alluded to her as one of the surviving roommates, what, if any, exculpatory evidence does she have? And did you make any efforts to find out, does Bethany hold the key to this case?
Bethany is, as you would appreciate, lawyered up. She is not talking. I think her stepmom is a lawyer. They have her fairly well insulated. If she has anything to say, that will be one of the mysteries that will be revealed at the trial. I did hear, and this isn't in the book, that she did testify to the grand jury. And that's another reason why she's not talking.
She testified to the grand jury because she was fighting. She did not want to come back to
She
Idaho.
did not want to come back, but they arranged something like this, a video. She was in Nevada at the time, and they arranged a video testimony to the grand jury. And one can understand that. I mean, she's a 21-year-old young woman. She's gone through a traumatic experience. She's now enrolled in another university. There are no real survivors in this story. It's a story really just about victims.
Have any of the grand jury testimonies leaked out to the public? Do we have any clue what she said? Because that's a
I have had some people with knowledge of the grand jury. There is a report, and this is a sensational report because it sounds, very incriminating, that Bethany and Dylan were texting before and after the murders to one another. What was said on those texts, was it we just heard a noise, whatever, but the reality seems to be that there was text exchanged, and the more perplexing reality is it wasn't until 8 hours later that they report the crimes, and then they don't even call 911, they call friends at a fraternity, and they come over, and they're the first people who call 911.
Yeah, that's always been a big mystery. I want to get to that, but before I do, let's stick with the grand jury. Do you know, did Steve Goncalves actually talk to the grand jury or the sources? Does that mean that the grand jurors or some court clerk or other juror source, because your book says that he was thinking about talking to grand jury sources, and I want to know, did you, and how did the revelation that came out of that Bethany and Dylan, as you just said, were allegedly texting, how did that come out? What were the dynamics of that? And did you talk to anybody that was associated with the grand jury?
I've talked to people who are aware of what was said at the grand jury. Steve Goncalves has texted. They're all over the internet. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of texts where he says that he has sources in the grand jury, and he shares them with internet commentators about what was said. They're matter of public record. You could probably Google them this afternoon if he hasn't deleted them at this point.
All right. Well, as long as we're talking about him, and I want to move on from that, but as long as we're talking about him, what about this secret informant? We did an episode a while back about the potentiality of a secret informant, but in your book, you point out that Steve Goncalves became convinced that there is a protected source and was going to reach out, but the FBI told him through his attorney, Shannon Gray, that there would be legal consequences. So do you have any insight into the existence of this secret informant? Who it is, where they're coming from, and whether there are any bombshells ahead from the secret informant?
Well, after writing the book in April, there was a hearing in Moscow, and both the defense and the prosecution go before the court. They ask to they say they want to turn off the cameras. They want to seal discovery because they use the words, this would put a confidential source in jeopardy. And they both agree to do this. So that, to me, is a pretty big bombshell, and it would also seem to substantiate what Mr. Goncalves was saying on the internet about this source.
So there is a secret source. There is a secret source.
The prosecution and defense both have agreed to that, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah. So I have a question. So do you think that it was more to protect the confidential source, to have everything sealed, or it was for Brian Kohberger to have a fair trial and not have all this, pre-trial publicity?
I think the way it's worded, it was to protect the confidential source. They said it would put in danger, in jeopardy. That was the word they used, in jeopardy.
And you're talking about the court hearing?
Yes, they said the source, yes, if I remember it correctly, yes.
Okay, because there's 4 reasons why they seal those documents.
Right, but I think I might even have it somewhere around here. Oh,
look, we're making him do some research for us. Yolie, good question.
Here's what they say. The documents contain facts or statements that might endanger the life or safety of individuals. That's what the defense said.
Right.
So that's a direct quote from the defense. And I just happen to have that handy. I don't know why, but yeah, I'm in my office now. You've got me.
I'm always a skeptic of all of those things. My view, and I might be, tell me I'm wrong, but my view is they don't want to show their work. They're like that kid in the back row who never wanted anybody to copy off his paper. That's my opinion.
You're an attorney, but what I found interesting, the defense, the prosecution then agrees with this, goes along with this, because they say, by releasing the discovery evidence, and this is what they say, could, quote, disclose the identity of a confidential source. They agree with them, and they use the words confidential source.
Right. Okay.
And that also underlined, I think, reconfirmed a lot of the things I said in my book, too. So it makes the mystery a lot more perplexing, and I think a lot more compelling to people.
Sure, you're right. Well, okay, we're going to get to your conclusions, and we're going to give you ample time to state your conclusions and what you found. But before we get there, I just have a couple of questions. And, I've never bought that one person could go into that house, and according to your timeline and also the probable cause affidavit, how could one person go into that house and in 8 or 10 minutes commit 4 murders with a knife? I'll be honest with you and tell you, I don't believe it. So what do you say to people like me who don't believe it?
And I said, I went in there with the same sort of skepticism that you had. And then as the authorities explained it to me, if there had been more people involved, you would have had more blood. They couldn't have covered up all the blood. There would have been a trail of blood. Here with one person, at least you could cover up a trail of blood, perhaps. There would have been more DNA. There would have been more cars seen on the surveillance videos. And they said, most importantly, you would have had a logic, a reason that made sense if there were a group of people involved. It would have seemed more like a transactional murder. There would have been a reason behind it, drugs or whatever, or robbery, or who knows. Or then you would have found the connections between the people. And
so what changed your mind?
The lack of all these different evidence, the lack of finding these things convinced me that the only plausible explanation that it was one person, there was none of the other clues there, so you had to believe what was there. What was left was the only thing that made sense, even if it didn't seem probable.
Well, with all due respect to you, and I mean that sincerely, how could this have happened? And there's only one little teeny tiny little hidden footprint. There's only one little footprint in the whole place. And how is it, if your theory is right, and you may well be right, how is it that they didn't find anything at all in his car? 6 weeks later, they went through his car with a fine-tooth comb, no DNA, no blood, no fingerprints, no nothing. How can that be?
Here's what the prosecution and the legal authorities say. Their theory is that before the murders, Kohberger bought in a local, I think it's a Walmart, a sort of a blue Dickies work suit. He put on this blue Dickies work suit. That got the blood. He had a plastic garbage bag in the trunk of his car. He put that in there, and on his circuitous route when he left, he got rid of the murder weapon and the bag with the jumpsuit. When he cleaned the car, he got rid of all the evidence. But to your point, and this is why there's going to be a trial,
sure.
There is no blood evidence in his apartment in Washington State.
Right.
There's nothing. There's not a shower. But they also didn't find a shower curtain. They didn't find any garbage. It had been meticulously cleaned. What I find most, you can take, and you're a lawyer, I'm just a layman. My daughter's a lawyer, that's as close as I get.
Good for her.
And you can impugn any bit of the evidence. And for every bit of evidence that will get introduced to court, for every authority that the prosecution brings, the dialectics of the courtroom means that the defense will bring in another authority equally well versed in the matters of DNA or cell phones triangulation, and that can be knocked out. But the overwhelming picture that they paint has too many convincing things to be sheer coincidence.
No.
Also, what is on the periphery of this is that after Kohberger is arrested, they take a DNA test. This DNA test, a cheek swab, according to what I've heard, matches the DNA on the touch DNA on the knife.
Touch DNA, and I'm sure you're aware, and I'm sure your daughter, the attorney, is aware that there are courts. I believe you live in Connecticut, don't you?
I do, yes.
Okay, there are two Connecticut cases that I cited in a previous episode where convictions were actually overturned because it was a touch DNA. And in one of those cases, truth to be told, there were other factors in that case, but a conviction for an extremely heinous crime there in Connecticut was overturned because the judge went through a very long litany, didn't come out and say it was junk science, but rejected all the touch DNA. Right. So that's shaky. That's shaky in my mind.
A lot of the evidence is shaky, but the idea that when he's arrested, he's taking his garbage and putting it in plastic bags to separate it. And then there's his alibi. We wait nearly 2 years for his alibi, and the defense comes up with an alibi that, well, at the time of the murders, he goes off 4 a.m. to a wilderness park on a frigid, cloudy night to look at the stars. And coincidentally, there are not only no witnesses, but his cell phone has been turned off for this time. Well, if I knew my client were not guilty, I'd be trying my best to get him out of jail for the 2 years he's been spending there. And I'd also be demanding that the authorities find the guilty person or persons.
Go ahead, Yolie. What were you going to say? Go ahead, Yolie.
You mentioned that you got some of the information from the authorities that were investigating this case. And in terms of what the authorities believe, did you just interview them and they told you what they thought, and that's how you came to this information?
There's a gag order involved in this case. I've spoke to some people. I've made promises of confidentiality. I've told you about as much as I can about talking to people as I can. I really don't want to go down that area. If you don't want to accept it, don't accept it.
No, that's okay. And the other question I have is,
go ahead, Yolie. Go ahead.
Did you see the testimony? It was a public hearing on the motions to compel. Did you see the testimony of Mr. Mowery or Detective Mowery and Officer Payne?
I've seen some of that, and yes, I'm aware of. Mowery is the Moscow police forensic expert who had. I think the defense will be able to impugn his training a bit. I mean, he had, a short course. To call him a forensic expert is perhaps an exaggeration.
Okay. And what about Payne's testimony? What did you think about his testimony?
I think Payne affidavit, more than his testimony, I think they're going to be able to find some contradictions in that and misstatements. It's, that affidavit, because it lays out the case, is going to be very, very important. And it's going to go over, with like biblical hermeneutics. They're going to go over it with a fine tooth comb. And I think they'll be able to find things wrong with it. But overall, I think, he built a pretty strong case. You have to remember, this is a police department. They have 32 officers. That's the entire police department. And they have to pull this together. And they weren't, one of the things I write about, they weren't getting all that much cooperation from the FBI. There was sort of an antagonism, a push and pull dialectic between these two sides. So I'm not quick to criticize Payne.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. The police departments in Washington, in Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho, were not cooperating. There was the incident where two Washington State University officers identified the Hyundai Elantra, and the owner had bushy eyebrows and matched Dylan Mortensen's description. They send it over to Moscow, Idaho. It gets filed and ignored for a month. You just alluded to the fact that the FBI and the Moscow Police Department were not working together. The Moscow Police Department apparently didn't even have a clue that the FBI was onto the guy as he was crossing the country. So my question to you is, do you think, it was 6 weeks between November 13th of 2022 and the day that Kohberger was arrested. Do you think if these police agencies would have cooperated, it wouldn't have been 6 weeks? It would have been faster?
I certainly do. You also point out about the Washington State Police who find the car parked at the Washington State student housing that belongs to Kohberger. The police send out this report, the Moscow police. They're looking for a white Hyundai. They say, I think originally 2011 to 2013. Kohberger's, I think, is a 2015. But
right.
The Washington State Police wait 4 days, 4 full days. You just got to begin their search to look for this car. And then they find it within, 10 minutes. You have a man on the loose who killed 4 students. You have a University of Washington State of 20,000 kids. It's 10 miles away. You think you'd be on that case right away. And then when the report comes in and they list the car as a white Hyundai Elantra, 2015 instead of the 2013, you think the Moscow police would have said, well, we better check this out anyway. It's someone who's only 10 miles away. There were a lot of mistakes. Particularly the most dangerous one. Right after the murder, Police Chief Fry, and he's very upset by the events. He went to the University of Idaho. He has 2 daughters who went there. This is a small community, is all part of it. And he sees the blood, I think you showed the photo before, the blood dripping out of the foundation of the house running down the side. And he tells people at the university not to worry. This is not a serial killer. Was a targeted crime. At this point, when he's telling people in the community not to worry, he has no idea who the killer is. He has no idea whether it's a serial killer. It could have been anyone. He could have still been on the loose in the university. And I think that was a dangerous, a potentially dangerous, even more dangerous misstep.
Well, that's in the governmental administrative handbook. Whenever there's a crisis, I don't care whether it's Brian Kohlberger or a hurricane or a tornado, that if you study government, or if someone actually does go into the administrative area, that's just in their playbook. No matter what it is, whether you know anything or not, you assuage the public. You tell them it's okay. You and I are both old enough to remember 3 Mile Island. I'm actually originally from Pennsylvania. Before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's dosimeter team actually even got there, they were saying, oh, there's no radiation that's been released to the public. How did they know that? The team wasn't even there yet testing the air with the dosimeters. So it's the same thing. I mean, it's in the administrative playbook. Just assuage the public. Tell them everything's okay. Now, there were a lot of mistakes made. One of the mistakes was, and I'd love your read on this, how can they try a case when that crime scene was so tainted? As you pointed out earlier, it was 8 hours between the time frame when we think the crime occurred, and then when the 911 was actually called at 11:58. And not only then the police get there and the kids are standing around, and A, they didn't throw them out, and B, they didn't get their names and statements, and C, they didn't seal off the crime scene immediately right then. So how can they even try a case when the crime scene has been so horribly mismanaged?
And to add to that, the crime scene doesn't exist anymore. They've knocked down the house. They've demolished the house. And the kids weren't just standing around, the kids outside the house. They'd all been inside the house, traipsing around, messing up whatever DNA evidence is there. There's 2 distinctions, I think, to be made about what I write about, and what I conclude, and what I theorize about this case. I believe that Kohlberger is guilty. I also believe they're going to have a hard time finding him guilty in a court of law. The only thing that's ultimately going to help Kohlberger is if the trial is in Moscow rather than having a change of venue, as his defense wants. Why do I say that? Well, the local Kirker church will be the predominant jury pool, because anyone from the university, I would imagine, will be kicked off of the jury. So that just leaves this large church group. This church group, and I've again spoken to Pastor Wilson about this, he said, we are in, quote, war with the police. We've protested their COVID pandemic restrictions. They've arrested our members. They've gone on the stand to testify about his Pastor Wilson's son and grandson for COVID violations. And he said to me, we know that the Moscow cops are liars. Therefore, if any one of my parishioners would ask me whether or not they should trust a Moscow cop on the stand testifying about Kohlberger, I would tell them to be very, very skeptical.
Yeah, Yolie and I actually did an episode on that. And I don't know if you want to chime in here, Yolie, but we did a whole episode on that church and the pastor and how it's dangerous to keep that trial in Moscow. Don't you agree, Yolie?
Yes, we did a show on that on your article, one of your articles, Mr. Blum, and it was the bias that the local church has towards the police and how that would affect the jury pool. And while it's true that, that anybody from the Idaho State University would likely get kicked off the jury, there's only so many peremptory challenges you can do. The others are for cause. And as long as you can get a juror to say, even though I work at the university or I attend the university, I can be fair and impartial, and not biased, then, they could serve. But it is going to be a hard one because of the small community there and the big part of what the university employs a lot of people in that town.
You know,
And
Right.
yeah,
and the irony of what you're saying, pardon me for interrupting, I apologize, is that it's the defense which is called for this hearing on August 29th to try to move the trial out of Moscow to somewhere else in the state. And it's the defense that could, you seem to believe, as I believe, would benefit the most if the trial stayed in Moscow. And that leads me back to their real ultimate strategy. Is all about delay to buy time. Because while you are able to raise holes in the entire argument, I think the defense is coming to the realization, especially as their alibi shows, that they're going to have a hard time if we have to deal with the facts in this case.
Oh, I don't know. I really don't know. And again, with all due respect, because I love your writing. I used to read you in the Village Voice in the New York Times. But okay, another huge problem, another huge hole in this case is that Mr. Kohlberger studied under Dr. Catherine Ramsland, as you pointed out in the book, and we actually did an episode on that also. So if he studied and he has all these degrees and he's studying for a PhD in criminal justice and he's the perfect criminal and all that, why would he make so many mistakes? He took his own phone as he drove by 1122 King Road 12 times prior to the crime. That's not a perfect crime. Why did he leave the knife sheath behind? And why did he use his own car? I mean, anyone who watches the movies know you get a throwdown car. You get a car that you rent or you steal one before the crime. I have a hard time buying that it's this expert that studied so much. I have a really hard time with that.
And you have every reason to believe that way. But between the reality and what he envisioned, I think there was a large shadow, and he just screwed up time after time. I think he wasn't thinking as a graduate student all the time. A lot of it was controlled by mania. What I mean, for example, is on the night of the murders, and I write about this in my book, is the common knowledge or the common theory is that he was stalking the house. He drives by 3 times.
Right.
I hypothecate, theorize, that he wasn't stalking so much the house. He was trying to find the will to finally turn off the engine and stay there and go into the house and commit these murders. He still wasn't there yet. Each time he was trying to get away, and each time the demons inside him pulled him back. If he had stopped and if he was thinking rationally, he would have seen all the cars in front. He would have seen the DoorDash delivery at 4 a.m. This would have discouraged him that this was not the night for the murder. But he wasn't thinking in those terms. He wasn't thinking as a pragmatic murderer, as the smartest man in the room. He was thinking, his thoughts were filled with rage and demons. And I think those overwhelmed any logical planning of this murder.
but
I
that's,
think that, go ahead.
so that's the explanation that you're giving for why this graduate student would commit such a crime. But that entails going into his mind. And I think that's a kind of dangerous thing to do because we never know what somebody's thinking. And, it's one of these things where that's how you have to look at it in order to come to the conclusion that he did it. And, we don't know what was going on in his mind. And the other thing about his alibi I wanted to point out is that in the PCA, if I'm not mistaken, they have the vehicle going away from the crime in the opposite direction when the murders were occurring. So when Ann Taylor said, I'm going to use the prosecution's witnesses to prove his alibi, that I understood it to be that she was precisely going to use the officers or the persons who stated that his car was going in the opposite direction or driving at the time the murders were committed, and he can't be at 2 places at once.
We talked about Brett Payne before. I think there are, as I said, agree with you, there are mistakes in that affidavit. what's going on in his mind. We do know what he said is going on in his mind. When he wrote about his visual snow, and he talked about his lack of remorse, how he saw himself as a piece of meat. He sounded, there are dozens and dozens of these posts that he put on the internet, and he sounded like a character in a Camus in The Stranger.
That was a long time ago, though.
Yes, it was a long time ago, but do you get over something like I don't know. This is shaping him. Also, the prosecution is going to add sort of this existential jolt to his whole psyche, being he's about to lose his teaching assistantship. And on one side, you have to give Kohberger a great deal of credit. He's a guy who reinvents himself. He kicks heroin. He loses 100 and some odd pounds. He moves from a junior college to a renowned university to a great graduate school, and he's now a teaching assistant, and they're paying him to go there, and he's going to become a doctorate. And now all this is going to be pulled away because he's getting into fights with the professors, the administration there. He's just too volatile. The students are complaining, and he's about to lose all this. Everything he's worked for the past 5 years or so to reinvent himself. And that's an existential jolt to his psyche, I will suggest.
Well, I don't know. I have some other problems with the whole thing. I'm just not convinced. But one of the things that I found interesting, let's go back to the night of when this happened. You suggest in your book that Maddie was the target. You suggest everybody has said that they thought Kaylee was the prime target, but in your book you say that Maddie was the target. And if this is true, then why? I guess you say that Kaylee had been hacked with particular ferocity. Maddie's wounds appeared less feral, more measured, at least in comparison. So why do you feel that Maddie was the target here?
Well, when the suspect enters the house, he enters from the sliding door in the kitchen on the second floor. There are 2 bedrooms on the second floor. He could have gone to either of those bedrooms where there are students that night. He doesn't. He instead goes up a narrow staircase, deliberately, doesn't seem to hesitate, and goes into Maddie's room. He doesn't suspect to find 2 women there. Kaylee is there, staying there. She's just in for this weekend. She came in to show off her new car, to try to either reunite or confirm her dissolution with her boyfriend. He sees Maddie first, and he kills her first. What Kaylee then does is, what I've heard, is she fights back. I mean, she's a tigress. She gets out of the bed, and she goes back to the far wall of the room. It's not that far, but just beyond the bed. And she's sort of cornered in there. And she's fighting, and he's moving in. And that's why her rooms are particularly vicious, because he has to, it's hard to unfortunately, to kill her. I mean, it's grim, it's grotesque. But he's almost met his match.
So I don't think anybody can say why one would commit murder, but the victim of his crime sort of seems to align with his antisocial behavior when it comes to pursuing women. Do you think that had anything to do with why he committed this murder, or was it fully an obsession with one person?
I think it's a combination of both. Towards his relationship with women. When he first comes to graduate school in Washington, he is invited to a pool party in Moscow. And he goes to this pool party, and I've spoken to the people there, and I write about this in the book. And he sees 2 women in black 2-piece bathing suits, and he's sitting at the edge of the pool, and he goes up to them. He asks first one woman for his number, and he gets the number, and he goes to the next one, and he also gets her phone number. And then he leaves the party. The women, I spoke with them, he never received any calls from him. However, after his arrest, they realized that in the weeks following that pool party, they got a series of hang-up calls. And they now theorize perhaps that was Kohberger. And that would go to the point of his inability to really interact with women in any companionable or even romantic way.
But there is that one date that supposedly happened where even though he kind of was off-putting to the girl, that he was still able to at least hang out with her. But it also is weird too that if he's unable, it's hard. I mean, I can't put myself in the mindset of someone who's afraid to talk to a woman for obvious reasons. But the, like, you know, audacity, trying to figure out an appropriate way to say this, but to just go up to two girls, ask for their number one after another, and then also be on Tinder and be maybe a little off-putting, trying to tickle some girls or whatever, shows that he had some level of success at least.
And that's just it. He kept on getting closer. His whole life was about having some success, but ultimately, I believe he felt that he just could not fit into this world that was full of promise. He had all this academic promise too. He was on the verge of a pretty interesting career. He was on the verge of escaping from his sort of hard-scrabble roots into a more rarefied world. Yet he couldn't quite make it. You talk about that date with the woman who he met at school, and his taglines are when he sends her a text, "You have good birthing hips."
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand the perspective where trying to fit in and not finding yourself, where it's just like, oh, I'm going to this school, I'm having a good career at school, and it's falling apart, and I am able to talk to women and women are receptive to me, but I always mess it up, and I understand that.
Now, what about? Oh, go ahead, Red. Go ahead.
I'm almost thinking that his existential pessimism and his core beliefs towards the female gender, I feel like this is kind of going hand in hand when it comes to the intent of this specific crime. I'm not sure if he also had homicidal, tendencies before these beliefs were developed, but I do think it played a hand in what kind of victim he chose.
I think you're probably right.
I don't know. Now, the book, to go to something we were talking about before, where are your sources? How, didn't you pull this out of your ear? The very back of the book has a bunch of pages where, with all due respect, Mr. Blum tells us that he had, 324 interviews. 324 interviews, and he tells us who his sources were, although you may not have known this, Mr. Blum, but I was a journalist for a while. Before I went to law school, I was a radio and TV journalist, and I understand the need to protect sources. If you don't protect your sources, they're going to dry out, and you're going to be bagging groceries at Walmart. So I understand that. I understand that fully. But I'm just wondering. I'm wondering if we can push you. If we can push you outside of this book and have you tell us some of the stuff. Didn't you, in all of your 324 interviews and going around the scene, didn't you find that maybe there were some rabbit holes that had been unpursued? Are there things outside of the four corners of the book that you can tell us and break some news here?
All right. There's something I'm looking into now, and I'm not the only one looking into it now. The federal authorities are looking into a stolen lab card at Washington State University that might have been used. They're investigating, and many federal authorities believe, by Kohberger to get the materials or the chemicals to make a bomb.
No.
And was Kohberger manufacturing a bomb that he intended to use? Where he was going to use it? Was the house a target for a bomb? Was it somewhere else? But this is what is still being investigated as we sit here and speak today.
Well, all right. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far because I want to go down a couple of other ones. But I mean,
okay.
Other than the speculation that maybe
I think that's enough rabbit holes. You're right.
Well, no, wait. in addition to the evidence that the suspicion that he might have taken this lab cart, when they went through his apartment there at WSU, did they find anything? Did they find any bomb making materials? Did they find a cart? Did they find any evidence of that?
They are analyzing the card, which I think they now have in their possession, and they're trying to put it when it was used and when it was used for entry and exit at times into a chem lab at Washington State University.
But that didn't answer my question.
I'm being vague. It's particularly because I don't have the whole facts. It's developing, and when I get it, I will write it in airmail. But if you want to, and I'm not the only one pursuing this. I know there are other journalists out there trying to get this, but I think it's going to be potentially a big story in the weeks to come.
No,
Really?
let me ask you a question. Do you know if Brian Koberger had any chemistry background?
I don't know that.
And in terms of how he murdered the students, like you said.
Excuse me, I do know he was not, there was no reason for him to have a card for entry into the chem lab. And you know, as we all know, you can just go on the internet to make a bomb with chemicals.
Right. So
unfortunately, those of us here in the Boston area know that all too well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Yolie.
So the other question was, in terms of, I know you've heard in the media stories about how Brian Koberger was a vegan and how he tried to cut fish for a job and he just was a failure at that. And that he also was very particular about the pans being used. And, you know, this is all things that, you know, maybe relatives and people who knew him are saying. And if it's true, because we don't know if that's true, but that would lead me to believe that he wouldn't be the type to go in and do such a messy crime. He would be more of the kind of person that would, you know, unalive somebody by shooting them, but this messiness, this horrific bloody mess, it just doesn't seem to me like he would do that. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, to begin with, I have no idea, you know, what kind of person commits a crime like that, but it wasn't that messy. That was the interesting thing. I mean, he did not leave a trail. There's no trail of blood to the street, to the car. It was a very fastidious crime in many ways, except for one thing. He left the knife behind. And that goes to my original theory or hypothesis that when he got to the room to kill Maddie, he was surprised to find someone else there. And in that struggle, his previous plan, all his meticulous planning began to fall apart. I think that was what set his things off. I also think that if he continued, if Zaina and Ethan had not come out and confronted him, if Zaina hadn't said there's someone here, I think like Dylan Mortensen, he would have just walked on by. He would have been locked in his own, he would have left. If they hadn't spoken up, I think they sealed their own death.
Now, when you say that Zaina was the one who said there's someone here, how did you come to that conclusion?
The police said that. That's what I was told. And I think they fairly make the case in the affidavit, that Payne's affidavit. If you look at it closely, I think that's what he's implying. And that was what's confirmed to me.
Okay. I just was talking about that final epilogue in your book about where you talk about the sources that you did have and that you can't have sources. I thought it was really interesting that you indicated that you had not talked to Steve Goncalves. Now, here's a guy that doesn't mind talking to people. We've talked to him. We've corresponded with him. He's never actually agreed to come on the podcast, but we go back and forth with him. And I told him that we were going to be talking to you today, and I asked him if he had anything to say to you. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read you the email that I got just this morning.
Sure.
From Steve Goncalves to me. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for this opportunity. We have one primary question regarding Blum's book. What evidence supports the theory that BK was focused on Maddie May. I think we talked about that, but if you could briefly address that before I go on to the next one.
Sure. Well, let me preface that by addressing Mr. Goncalves, who's been criticizing me and my book, refusing to talk to me on many attempts. I make this out. My heart goes out to him. I certainly, as I said, I'm the father of 3 children. You lose a daughter, a man who says, you send your daughter off to college and she comes back to you in an urn. I'm not going to be the one to criticize him and to go back and forth in any detail. Again, my heart goes out to him. I also think there's something really heroic, and I tried to portray him this way in my book. I mean, if you've read the book, I think a man who's saying, I'm not going to allow my daughter's murderer to get away. I'm not going to allow this to become a cold case. I'm going to get to the bottom of things. I think that dedication to make sure that there's some sort of justice for his daughter is admirable. It makes him almost a Shakespearean character. That said, again, I don't want to go back and forth. I've discussed why I believe Maddie is the target. I've talked at the logic of how he went into the room. He had no idea that Kaylee was there. He didn't expect her. I've gone through that, but I do not, as I've said, I offered Mr. Goncalves the opportunity to speak with me. I spoke to his attorney. His attorney and I had a meal. I've seen what he's published on the internet. I've seen his interviews on the internet, and I'll stand by what's written in the book.
Okay. Then he goes on to say, in our recent meeting with the prosecution team, they expressed difficulty in establishing direct connections between Bryan Kohberger and the victims. If Blum has stumbled across some substantial evidence, please get in touch with Thompson and share it promptly. We are, and this was interesting, we are collaborating with a digital forensics company to strengthen these connections. Meanwhile, the court's reliance on an outdated gag order is proving ineffective, as seen with Blum's book and the true crime communities shaping these new narratives and expectations. It is the prosecution's responsibility to present the unembellished truth without any fictional elements, and their task becomes increasingly difficult with each passing. We no longer live in a world where media is centralized on black and white TVs run by the ABC networks. Today, people can access countless points of view from all over the world, and most of these content providers are not under the control of any courtroom, which I would contend is a good thing. Let's hope Judge wakes up and starts being proactive in addressing this situation. Thank you for your time and efforts in the case, Steve Goncalves. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that or not.
I think I would agree with him. I think Judge should remove the gag order. I think we should, get to the bottom of things. I think the delay of this trial, I had a Washington Post op-ed yesterday on the delay of the trial. It goes to the problems with the gag order. When there's a gag order, you have a vacuum. It's not that things become quiet. It's not that the case is not talked about. As you showed on the screen, all those books. Have you been talking about the case, as you've said, for so many episodes? Let's get rid of the fatuous reports. Let's get rid of the malignant, vicious reports on the internet that are aimed at certain people. And let's try to get to the truth. And let's allow journalists to go unshackled to try to get to the bottom of things. So I'm in agreement with Mr. Goncalves.
Okay, let me ask you this. We've been taking pot shots at you because honestly, I don't believe that it happened that way. I won't be able to believe it, but I'm going to give you the final word as to, we didn't really get into your final analysis and what you thought, but I'm going to give you the last shot to tell us what you found through your 328 interviews. What's your theory?
My theory is that Bryan Kohberger, at one point in his time in Moscow, came across Maddie Mogan. He did not have to speak with her. The defense and the prosecution both agree that there was no communication, no following on social media of any of the 4 victims. I don't think Brian Koberger needed to necessarily have a verbal interaction with her or a social media interaction. He was a man who lived by obsessions. He became fixated by her ebullience, her beauty, her blondness, whatever. And he would, from time to time, see her, and he would be outside the house when the parties were going on. He would be driving by or whatever, and he felt rebuked that this was a world where he could not enter, and he targeted her. When he got to the house, things fell apart, his entire plan, and other people were killed as collateral damage. It's a tragedy. It's a story where there are no survivors, only victims. And what I tried to do in my book is to make a suspenseful, compelling police drama and also a portrait of the people involved. I tried to tell what is a story, and I tried to tell the story as accurately as possible.
Will there be a sequel? I mean, with the trial, they've now set the trial for June of 2015. That's actually been established. Did I say 2015?
2025.
They've actually set the trial down now for
10 years ago.
June of 2025.
June 2nd, 2025, yeah.
Yeah, so now after the trial, will you write a sequel?
It's something I'm considering.
Okay, all right. All right, any closing thoughts, Lainey or Yolie or Red? I think Red's batteries died.
Oh. No, I
Oh.
don't have any closing thoughts. It's just I disagree with your theory, but that's that's just my opinion, and you have your opinion. And thank you for coming and sharing it with us.
And thank you for listening to my theory and hopefully reading my book and getting the overview of the story.
Lainey, any closing thoughts?
As every episode we do, I never have a concrete feeling or idea of what's happening. Like you said, Howard is just like, was he targeting one person? Or we've talked about with, forensic in the past where there are multiple people. This episode, you really got my attention stuck on the fact that we're allegedly remembering his bushy eyebrows over a potential blue bodysuit, which is something that I'm going to be laying in bed awake now thinking. Yeah, I don't necessarily feel strongly. I think there's so many possibilities and we're going to have to see what happens. Obviously, it's a huge tragedy, but I do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to discuss it with us and share your opinions and share, your book. And thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
Okay, so we always tell our viewers at the end of each episode, please be kind, whether you're in the grocery store or the gas station. You don't know what the other person is going through, so be kind there and be kind down in our comments. We'd love to hear your comments. Thank you very much, Mr. Blum, for being with us. We do appreciate it, and we would love to hear people's comments. So have a great day.
Buy the book.
You have been watching About the Law, a production of the law offices of Andrew D. Myers in Methuen in the Merrimack Valley of Massachusetts and in Derry, just outside of Manchester, New Hampshire. Remember to click the like and subscribe buttons down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to share it with your friends and others. If you'd like to talk to me about an injury case, a car accident, a slip and fall, a serious bodily injury case, or some other case, please feel free to contact me. I'd love to talk to you. You can contact us through my website at attorney-myers.com. We have a contact us block, or you can call on one of the telephone numbers we've given there, or you can email me at andrew@attorney-myers.com. The foregoing is offered for informational purposes only. It is not intended as and does not constitute legal advice. Laws vary widely from state to state. You should rely only on the advice given to you during a personal consultation by a local attorney thoroughly familiar with state laws and the area of practice in which your concern lies. This podcast must be and hereby is labeled advertisement in some jurisdictions. And that's that.
And that's that.
And that's that.
Yeah,
What an
Yolie,
awesome. Oh, sorry.
that was a great episode. Poor Red's battery died. Her battery died. That's why she had to go. But you don't agree with all the people that you interview. You don't agree with your sources. If you only interview people you agree with, that cuts down half the number of people that you could possibly talk to.
What's the exact name of the book?
When the Night Comes Falling.
Discovery is being given to us as if we're living in a snow globe,